In this tutorial, I'll look at how to draw a base texture for wood grain. I'll start out here with a new document, pressing Ctrl N, and making this new document, let's say 1500 on a side. What we're going to draw here is not a particular piece of wood, but a large section of raw wood we can use to cut planks out of for furniture, for example, or pieces of a floor. We'll start out with a big document and add some grain in. I'll hit OK, and then I'll fill this with a 50% gray, pressing Shift F5, and in the Fill dialog, choosing 50% gray. Now I'll add some grain in, choosing Filter and Filter Gallery. In the Filter Gallery, I'll go under Grain, and under Grain here, I'll choose the grain type of Vertical. I'll back off the intensity and contrast so I've got gray against gray, and click OK. We're starting to get, well, at least lines. Remember, the way to think of it is not how do I paint the actual material, but what is the pattern here? In this case, wood is a generally parallel series of lines with some variation in wave. Now I'll blur this together, choosing Filter, Blur, and Motion Blur. In my Motion Blur, I'll put the angle to match the grain, in this case 90, and bump up the distance to maybe 20 or so. I'll click OK, and now I've got more or less smooth lines. Now I'll give them a little bit of wiggle and spread. They're parallel, which is OK. The color varies, which is good, but they're very even in their distribution. There's no width variation across them. I'll choose Filter and Liquify. In the Liquify tool, I'll zoom out by pressing Z and holding Alt and clicking once. Then I'll press B for the Bloat tool. And in the Bloat tool, I usually go into the Advanced mode, bring up the brush size, down the density, and pull that brush rate back a bit, maybe 60 or so. I'll bring that brush size up, maybe somewhere in the, we'll call it 300 range. And now very carefully I'm going to bloat open this grain, holding my hand more or less steady, opening up the grain structure and adding a little bit of, well, hand-done wiggle. I'll open this up and make sure I come back to the top. If you get a place that looks like a natural bow, that's okay. Our purpose here, as we do this, is to make that grain wave, as we'd see naturally in a tree. It's a number of steps, because a tree grows, and we need to see that this tree has grown and twisted over time. So using the Bloat tool to start out by changing the width of that grain structure is a great way to do this. I'll run through this a few more times, bloating open that grain structure, and show what it looks like when I'm done. I've bloated open my grain structure, going from top to bottom and keeping my hand relatively even. I'll click OK to accept this, and there's the start of my grain. Now I'm going to change the size of it, pressing Ctrl-Alt-I for image size, and bringing this up to, let's say, 3000 square. I'll press Ctrl-0 to zoom extents. What I've done by enlarging that is ask Photoshop to interpolate new pixels. If we look at this grain structure up close, we can see it's got now a little bit of blur to it, where those lines were clear. This helps give me a little softness to that grain structure, especially when I reduce it down later if I cut it and paste it into a texture. Now I'll add in some waviness into this wood. I'll choose Filter and Liquify again. In this case, I'm going to use my Forward Warp tool, and I'll give that brush a very big size. I'll hold down the right bracket until here's almost 2000. I'll brush this along. It's important in here to back off that brush pressure. This way we don't get giant zigzags in the wood. Remember, we don't want wild zebra stripes. We want a gentle shift in grain pattern. And if you pull it off the edge a little bit, just nudge it back. I'm going to use that Forward Warp tool to add in a little bit of curvature across. Trees grow in arcs. Although we think of them as straight, it's that we cut them in straight boards, and so it's really important to get a little bit of natural wave in this. Not necessarily giant zigzags again, but a bit of a curve here and there. You can always fix up any spots you missed, and then we'll switch over to the Bloat tool and put some knots in. Here in the Bloat tool, I'll back off that size down in the 300 range or so again. Notice that the 300 size brush is now much smaller proportionate to the size of the wood sample. I'll start to bloat open parts, not necessarily making knots, but making more localized places where branches might have grown. I'll add some in, and depending on what wood it is you're modeling, whether it's maple, fir, curly maple, pine, knotty pine, and so on, you may have no knots, some knots, or a lot of knots. I'll add in a moderate amount, looking for places where the grain has a little natural curve. It's okay in places to give it more of an elongated shape, or even to zig it slightly to the side. A knot is actually where a branch has grown, and so some places give us a fairly round knot, some more of a teardrop or paisley shape, and still others are an elongated shape. Now that I've got my knots in, I'm going to zoom in on one of them and switch over to my twirl tool. The twirl tool is the final step in the knots. I'll back off the size one more time, down in the 50 or 60 range, and start to twirl this in. If you need, bring up the brush pressure, and this will help grab maybe a dark color and make a bit of a dot. Now we don't need to have too many rings, but really kind of an elongated, fuzzy, round shape. I'll press Ctrl 0 to zoom out, Z to zoom in, and pick another knot area. C takes me back to my twirl tool, and I'll twirl in another knot. It's okay if some knots are sort of formed, if they end up being more of a round shape with a little bit of a ringing structure. We don't need to see every piece of the grain, but really that there is a structure to the wood, or rather a structure to the drawing, that we associate with wood grain. Sometimes our twirl tool gives us just a little bit of a local zig, and that's enough. I'll put a few more in, and show what this looks like when I'm done. I've added in a few more knots, and I feel pretty good with the structure of this wood grain. You can also, at this stage, go back to that bloat tool, and just bloat open a few more spaces if you'd like. I'll bring that structure up, or rather the brush size, in the, we'll call it 200 range. I can always use those brackets if I need. Now I'll just locally bloat open a couple of areas. What we're after here is a generally parallel structure, so don't be afraid to come back and massage it just a bit so that it's less regular. Our friend here is actually slight irregularity, so just a little bit of careful work to introduce waniness in the wood, where it's got kind of a long streak of maybe either dead wood or bark or something similar that got cut when it was cut into boards will help add to the believability. I'll click OK when I'm done, and give Photoshop a minute to process, and then look back at the wood grain. It's pretty good, and I'm ready for the color. I'll double-click on the background, click OK, and now it's a new layer. I'll slip a layer underneath it, and set my overlayer here to, well, nothing yet. On this new layer, I'll pick a color that's going to be this wood grain. In this case, I'm going to add in, let's say, a warm pale tan, and see how that looks. I'll fill it with a paint bucket, pressing G, and if needed, flying out the gradient tool to choose the paint bucket. I'll fill that under layer, layer 1 in this case, with that warm tan. And now I'll switch layer 0 over to a color burn. This gives me a bright wood tone. As an alternate, I can choose linear burn and get a much darker, deeper tone. We can look through our other blending modes if we need. For example, soft light is great for something like a light wood, like a birch, where it's a very light grain structure. Hard light tends to be a little bit black. We get a little bit too much graininess showing. The same goes with multiply. We tend to see a lot of black in there. Multiply, as opposed to color burn, tends to get darker and charcoal. So if you've got a wood that is black and white or similar, multiply may work. But I'm going to stick with color burn here. Then I'll select that undercolor, press Ctrl U, and back off the lightness and the saturation just a bit. Now I'm getting into the, we'll call it pine or maybe fir range. We can always go a little bit lighter if we need, and click OK. What I've got so far is a wood grain with value variation, and now I'm going to add in some tonal variation as well. I'll turn off my wood grain layer, press I for eyedropper, and sample that under layer. Then turn back on the wood grain, and on a new layer over my initial base color, paint. I'll press B for brush, and click on that foreground color that I eyedroppered. I'll add in a slight bit of hue variation. In this case, maybe taking that hue down into the low 40s to add some warmth into it. I'll size up the brush using the square brackets, and then right-click to make sure its hardness is at 0. I'm going to brush in here at a normal blending mode, at maybe about 60% opacity or so, and I'll brush in a little bit of streak along this wood. What I'm after here is a gentle variation. I don't want, again, zebra stripes, but rather a tonal variety across the wood grain. So there are some areas that are a little warmer, some are a little cooler, a little yellower, a little more reddish. We want to think of it in terms of maybe foods to give us a good example. Right now I've got some cherry going on and some honey tones, or maybe unripe mango. If it sounds like I'm getting very flowery with the language, let me give you a tip. This is great when you're talking about color. If you say yellow, everybody has a good idea in their mind of what they think yellow is. But if you say lemon yellow, that's pretty straightforward. If you say honey, that's different than lemon, and so people can get a hold of that color in their mind. I've got some value and hue variation, and I can continue in here if needed, painting in darker wood, for example, backing off the brightness just a bit, and brushing in just a little bit of dark streak. If it's too much, you can always pull back the opacity. Again, subtlety is the key. We don't need giant garish colors. It's not supposed to be red and yellow and blue. It's supposed to be subtle tones. I'm going to brush this over, in this case hitting most of the wood grain with this overlay, so I start to get some dark tones and yellow peeking through. This is now a rich wood tone. We can always take this undercolor, press Ctrl U, and do a little bit of hue shifting. If it's too yellow-green, I'll just pull it to the left a bit, and now I'm into a light cherry stain. There's my wood grain, and it's ready for cutting out pieces. In this case, this is a veneer that's really good for furniture. I could also take this and colorize in different ways. Again, pulling down lightness and increasing saturation, and maybe even swinging the hue around to get much warmer. And now we're into our walnut tones. It's really up to you where you'd like to take it. Play with the over and under color and blending mode of that wood grain. You can even go in and enhance the gray value before the wood grain gets overlaid, so you can get greater or lesser variation. So where would I go from here? I'll take these 3 layers and group them by pressing Ctrl G, hold Alt, and clone that group down, and then press Ctrl E to flatten it. Now I've got a flattened copy to copy and paste planks out of, and my original working group for adjusting colors. If I take my marquee using a fixed size marquee, and here's a 512 by, let's say 1024, that's a nice big plank. That's suitable for, let's say, the side of a cabinet. I can even take this and increase that height. I've got some good working size to play with in here. So a 512 by 2048 plank in here is not out of the question. This is more suitable, let's say, for a table, or maybe the top of a desk. And I've got enough grain structure in here that I can copy and paste this into things like a floor. For floor planks, I'll go narrower. Here's 256 by 2048. And it's great for putting together in a wood floor, where there's enough wood grain going on for some really natural variation. So remember, when you're making your wood grain, make a sample that really couldn't come from any earthly tree. In reality, this is about 8 feet square, but it gives us enough wood area to be able to cut and paste out the pieces we need to assemble our texture, as if we're actually building the object, so it's believable and readable as made of wood correctly in our rendering.